So this video follows on from our video where we talked about creating users and allocating users to groups and things of that nature. Now that you've got users configured, right, and you've got groups configured, we now look at this sort of access that you can grant against people, right, against users of the system. So what we're going to do is we're going to open up the control panel over here. We've got it right there on our desktop. Make that bigger. And of course, we talked about users, we talked about groups. So if you need to learn a little bit more about that, go and check out that particular video. But now we're looking at shared folder, and we're going to focus a little bit on file services as well. All right. Let's firstly look at file services. We're going to open that up right there. Now, there are a few things in here. Now, file services is how do you want to use your Synology NAS? How do you want to access your Synology NAS on the network? Of course, the whole point of the Synology NAS is that you've got all of your disks on your Synology NAS, you're creating a storage pool, you're creating a volume, and then you want people to be able to access that volume. That could be yourself, it could be your people that work in your company, in your small, medium, large business, whatever that may be. Now, there's a couple of options in here, three: SMB, AFP, and NFS. Now, these are all protocols to be able to access the data of your Synology NAS on a network. Now, of course, the most important thing is making sure that your Synology NAS is on the network, it's configured correctly, and it's accessible on the network side of things anyway, right? So you can actually access the Synology NAS. You could ping the Synology NAS on the network, making sure it's connected to a switch of some sort, and all of that, right? So if all of that is working well, that's good. Now you turn on some of these protocols to allow specific computers and other devices on your network to be able to connect to your Synology NAS. Now, the three main ones, SMB, AFP, and NFS. The first one, SMB, which is a protocol that is used quite a lot across multiple operating systems. All right, so Windows, for example, will use SMB a lot. And if you enable that, so if yours is not ticked, you can tick on that right there. The work group, that's fine. We can leave that as the default. But now you'll see that down the bottom, enter the below address to access shared folders using computer in your local network. So on your Windows computer, you should be able to open up start and run. So the run area, and type in // and then the name of your Synology NAS. So you need to know the name of your Synology NAS, and then you should be able to access your Synology NAS that way. Now, that is all directly connected to shared folders, because you need to have a shared folder created first to be able to then connect to the shared folder over the SMB protocol over this location right here. So what will happen is you do // Aguero Synology. You'll then open up your Windows Explorer, and you'll be able to see the shared folders, of course, and that is all based, of course, on the user type. It will likely ask you for usernames and passwords, and that's when you would log in with the specific usernames and passwords that have been configured on your Synology NAS. So the administrators, the users on your Synology NAS, you use those credentials to then access the actual // Synology NAS name. Right? You can also access your Synology NAS over the IP address. So if you do know the IP address, you can go and type that in as well. // the IP address of your Synology NAS. Now, if for whatever reason you cannot access the actual name itself, there's possibly an issue on your network around DNS. So you'll have to go and check some of these DNS settings. Essentially, DNS will translate a name such as this, a host name or a fully qualified name, an FQDN name, to an IP address. So if this is not visible on your network, if there isn't a DNS entry on your network, on your DNS server, for example, then you won't be able to access it over the name. Rather, it will be over the IP address. So just be aware of that if your name doesn't work, that's generally why. Okay. Then you've got your Mac. Now on your Mac, slightly different. You have to connect over the Finder to SMB // Aguero Synology, or the name of your Synology NAS, and that will show up that way. Now, the great thing is generally on Windows and on the Mac, you may not even have to type this in to a specific area. You could just open up your Finder or open up your network area within your Windows Explorer on a Windows PC, and it may actually just be listed there if your NAS is being discovered on the network. Okay, so that's just another way to do that if you so choose to. Now, there are a few other things in here that you can actually change. You can actually do some log settings. So when do you want, so select the file, the operation events that you want to monitor via the transfer log. You can do some stuff there if you want to say logging, when people access certain things, all of that sort of stuff. So that if you need to get audited or something like that, you've got all the information readily available in logs. Advanced settings, well, WINS, we're not going to talk about WINS. WINS is an old protocol. Maximum SMB protocol, SMB 3. Minimum is SMB 2. So if you've got fairly new computers, you don't want any old computers to access your Synology NAS, you could disable some earlier versions of SMB. We're not going to talk about some of these other settings, so I'm just going to leave this all as the default, okay? So that's just the basics around SMB. So SMB can be used on Windows, can be used on the Mac. Then you've got AFP. Now AFP is traditionally only going to be used on a Mac computer. AFP won't work on Windows. You can get it to work, but there's different ways to do that, but I generally would not recommend using AFP for Windows. AFP is the Apple file protocol and is primarily used on Mac computers. Now, I would generally recommend that you don't even use AFP. There's no need. I would just use SMB for Mac and for Windows. Earlier versions of Mac OS, just to give you some background here, did have some connection problems and there was dropouts and speed issues intermittently with SMB, which is why AFP sometimes was a better option on earlier versions of macOS. But later versions of macOS have generally fixed that, so you should be okay to not even use AFP at all. But if you so want to, you can turn it on, and then you'll be able to access the Mac over the Finder, and instead of doing SMB, you do AFP, and then the Aguero NAS, the actual host name or the IP address into there. Then you've got NFS. Now, NFS is another protocol that can be used on a Mac or on Linux, right? That's another option there. Again, on Windows, not traditionally, not standard. You can get it working on Windows if you need to, but I would recommend, as I said, SMB for Windows. But NFS is an option there if you so want to use, for example, in a Linux environment. Another good purpose for NFS is if you're going to be using your Synology NAS to host virtual machines and sort of getting it talking to virtual environments, for example, such as VMware. There is a future video where we'll cover that specifically, but you're going to need NFS turned on because, for example, VMware, to be able to create what's called a data store based on some storage on your Synology NAS, it will use the NFS protocol. So that's why NFS may need to be turned on for that. And then there's some additional settings that you may want to configure and set up in there, okay? So that's the protocol itself. We're not going to cover these other three because we're focusing on shared folders, but SMB, AFP, and NFS are the three protocols that we're going to use. Now, having given you that big introduction, let's now look at shared folder. So within shared folder, I've already created some shared folders in here, right? So these are just some volumes that I've created. And this is essentially what's going to be accessible when I type in / Aguero Synology. I should see a list of these 4 if it's been set up that way. So for example, let's look at data. I'm going to select data and I'm going to click on edit. Here is my volume. So remember, you've got to create a volume first. So if you need to go and learn how to, the storage manager, there's a storage manager video. Look at that so you understand how to create, manage through storage manager, create a volume, create a storage pool. You need all of that configured first. You then will create an actual shared folder against a specific volume. Okay, so I've just created it against volume 1. All right. You can do things such as encryption if you want to encrypt that shared folder. Advanced if you want to set quotas. So how big can that folder get, for example? Permissions. Who has access to this? So again, we looked at another earlier video around users and groups. So go check that video out if you need to get a refresher. I've got admin, I've got John Smith, and I've got Plex. Those 3 have read-write access against that particular shared folder. All right, you can do some advanced permissions we're not going to look at. And then there's some NFS permissions. Now remember, NFS, of course, is the protocol. What I've got in here is I've got 3 IP addresses listed, and we'll cover this in a future video, but this is because these are 3 VMware ESXi hosts that I want to get access to my Synology NAS. So within NFS, I want to grant those 3 access to my VMware environment, and that's why I've listed those in there. All right. So back into here. So that is my data, right? So what I'll do is let's just look at creating a brand new shared folder altogether. create, you then go create something from scratch. All right, so let's just say we're going to create test share. Again, we're creating it against volume 1. If you've got more than one volume, you add it against that specific volume, right? The shared folder will be applied against a specific volume that you have determined. There's some settings in here. Do you want to enable the recycling bin against that particular share? You can do that, yes or no. Next. No, we don't want to encrypt it for now. We'll leave all this as the default and apply. All right, so that is now going to create that particular share. It's going to ask me, well, who do you want access to this particular share? So in my case, I'm going to say, well, look, I want admin. I want to say the same people, John Smith and Plex, and that's it. So now there's a folder or a share here called test share. All right, there it is. So now I should be able to go and actually access that test share itself. So from within a Windows computer, from within a Mac, you should be able to access that data. Now let's just have a look at something else very, very quickly. We're just going to minimize this. You've got File Station. Now File Station, think of File Station the same as Windows Explorer on Windows or the Finder on a Mac. Here is my Aguero Synology, and here are my shares. These are the shares that we've created, and from within here, I can actually go into test share, and you see that that is empty. There's nothing in here. There's no folders. There's no files within this share. This is just a location where a computer can connect to, but there's actually nothing within it, right? So I can go and create a new folder, some folder, and I can create another folder. And then there it is, another folder, some folder. So there are now 2 folders within test share. All right? If I look at Plex, you'll see that there's a whole bunch of stuff in here, right? Folders and files, right? Test share. So that is now within File Station. I can just navigate through all of my shares that I've got listed in here, and there are the folders and the contents of those shares. Now that it is all set up, it's ready to go. If I just open up a Windows computer that I've just got it here set up and prepared earlier, to access it from a Windows PC, you can do in the Start menu and run into here, or run into there. If you're running on Windows 10, if you're running a different version of Windows, the process is pretty straightforward. It's nothing too special there. But just start and run, and then I can just type in / Aguero Synology, or the IP address of your Synology NAS, right? The name or the IP address. Click on OK. What will happen is it's now asking me for my credentials, asking me for my username and password for my Synology NAS. So this is where I enter in the credentials of my Synology NAS. Now I'm assuming that this Windows computer and on the Mac that we'll show you in a second are both accessible on the network the same as my Synology NAS is. They need to be able to connect to each other on a network through all of the network setups in the background. So there it is. There are my 5 shares that we've got on our Synology NAS, including the new one that we just created called test share. And then I can double click on that. And because my admin that I just used, the admin account, here are the 2 folders that I've just created. Right? So I can create another folder the same way that I can now on Windows and say created on Windows. There's a new folder. I can now add, copy, paste files, anything that I want into here. I can create another folder. Well, let's just create a bitmap file, just a text file. So there are 2 files in here on a folder called created on Windows within my test share. All right, so that's on Windows how you would access that. If I now go back to my Synology NAS and I open up my File Station, here is my test share. There it is, created on Windows, and within there are the 2 files that I've just uploaded. On the Mac, we go to the very top, connect to server. So this is on the Finder, go connect to server, right in there. It's going to bring up this window right here where I can now type in connect to server, SMB : Aguero NAS, the name of your NAS or the IP address. Select connect. The same as on Windows, is now going to ask me for the credentials. So we're going to type in the admin credentials that we just used. And there you go. I'm now presented with the area where I can now connect to which volume or share do I want to be able to connect to. So I'm going to also select test share. Click on OK. Create it on Windows. There's the contents. I can now say created on Mac. All right, that's it, done. I can go back onto here, and there's my new folder on my Synology NAS. And that's really how you would navigate to a share on a Synology NAS.